Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Drisha webinar, our Pre-Pesach series. I'm Malka Simkovich. Thank you so much for being here. We do want to see some faces, and if you're interested in turning on your video, please send us a message. We have Nisa Berzinbar here from Drisha. Thank you so much, Nisa, for being the brains behind this operation. So if you would like to turn on your video, please click on, if you see it, raise hand, or you can put something in the chat box because I would like to see some of you. All of you are muted, but at the end of this webinar, we will have a Q&A session. And for that Q&A session, if you have a question or a comment, you can, again, put something in the chat or raise your hand and you will be unmuted. So are we all good to go? Can we get a few faces up there if possible? All right, I'm gonna leave Nisa to that. Welcome. I wanna thank Drisha so much for thinking of new ways to bring learners together. I'm speaking to you from Chicago, and I know that we have attendees from all over the world. Right now we have 19 attendees and steadily growing in this webinar. So this is an incredible format for learning, and I really appreciate all that Drisha does. We're going to speak about Pesach in the ancient world, and I'm going to share a source sheet with you on my computer. So I'm going to pull up a source sheet. It's right over here. Technology is incredible. Unbelievable. Okay. And we'll get started. My face and Nisa's face are little, so I'm mainly looking at the source sheet. If you need anything, please try to get in touch with Nisa over the course of the next 45 minutes or so. Can you hear me? You can hear me? Okay. All right. We view Pesach as a cohesive holiday from start to finish. But biblically, many of us know that we're actually dealing with two separate holidays. We're dealing with Chag HaPesach, which is on the 14th. Sorry, I'm just gonna try to adjust this because I have a little bit of show and tell. A little bit of show and tell over here, so I want you to be able to see my Sfarim. So we have Chag HaPesach on the 14th of Nisan, and then we have a 7-day holiday, Chag HaMatzot. Until the rabbinic period, actually, these were two completely distinct holidays, and the first one was the primary one. The first one was covenantal, it was distinct, it was special, actually much more than Chag HaMatzot. So we had the Korban on the 14th of the month of Nisan. This Korban, the process for sacrificing it, actually begins on the 10th of Nisan, when the Israelites are told for the very first observance of this holiday to take the lamb, and then there's a process by which they sacrifice it. And of course, we all know the story of the blood being put on the doorpost on the night of the 14th of Nisan. And then we have a completely separate and distinct holiday, and that's Chag HaMatzot. By the rabbinic period, two things happen. The two holidays become fused into one. The question is why, and there are some theories that I will throw out over the course of this learning session. And also the messianic element becomes increasingly important in the rabbinic period. We don't see much messianism associated with this holiday or with these two holidays in the Second Temple period. And again, the question is why? What happens in the rabbinic period that brings this messianic element of Pesach to the fore? So before we look at how Pesach was celebrated in the Second Temple period, we are going to look at a few biblical sources. And now I direct you to the source sheet. Of course, the first time we see these two holidays, again, we're going to be speaking about them as two distinct holidays, the Chag HaPesach and Chag HaMatzot. We see, of course, in Shemot Perek Yud Bet. Again, with the bulk of the description regarding this season focused on Chag HaPesach, the Korban Pesach. So you see in Shemot Perek Yud Bet, Pasuk Vav 12:6, that you should On the 14th day, I have English over here also, if you want to take a look at the English. On the 14th day of the month, the whole assembled congregation of Israel will slaughter the Paschal lamb at twilight, and they shall take some of the blood, put it in the doorposts. And this goes on. And we don't see any mention of a 7-day holiday regarding getting rid of all leavened bread until verse 15. So you have to go all the way down. And then we read in verse 15, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. Shivat yamim matzot tochlu, ach b'yom harishon tashbitu teor mibateichem, on and on. Anybody who eats chametz, leavened bread, kikol ochel chametz, micharta hanefesh Yisrael. So this is serious stuff. If you eat leavened bread, you'll be cut off from the congregation of Israel from the first day of the holiday to the 7th month. And that's what we know about Chag HaMatzot. So actually, we don't see the word Chag regarding the second holiday in this passage. The word Chag is specific to the Chag HaPesach. So here we have two distinct holidays. And likewise, when we repeat these laws regarding Pesach in Sefer Vayikra, we also have these two distinct holidays. And here we have a covenantal aspect added to these holidays. So we're told B'chodesh Harishon B'arba Asar L'chodesh Bein Ha'arbaim Pesach LaHashem. So at twilight on the 14th day of the first month, there will be a Passover offering to the Lord, and then on the 15th is Chag HaMatzot, something totally different. Then we have this final verse before we move on to Shavuot. He crafted Isha LaHashem Shivat Yamim B'Yom HaShvi Mikra Kodesh Kol Melechet Avodah Lo Tasu. Don't do any melacha, any work for these 7 days. So why do I say that there's an added covenantal aspect to the holiday of Pesach in Vayikra? We have to understand what comes before this passage. So if you look right before Leviticus 23, 5-8, you see that we begin this section in Vayikra speaking about Shabbat. And of course, Shabbat is the covenantal affirmative affirmative action is not the right phrase, but it's the act of affirming regularly the covenantal relationship between Israel and God. I always say to my students that in the Second Temple period, there were 3 identifying markers of Jewish practice in the Second Temple period. There was dietary law, circumcision, and Shabbat. And then a lot of my students say, yeah, and all the other holidays, right? Because we have all these texts in the Second Temple period that talk about Shavuot and Sukkot and Pesach, and they were very, very important. But we cannot lump the holidays with Shabbat. Shabbat is actually distinct because Shabbat is connected to the covenantal relationship. But here we have a juxtaposition. And the juxtaposition is that we begin a section with Shabbat, and then we segue into Pesach. So if you look at Vayikra 23, 1-4, you see that this section on holidays begins with Sheshet Yamim Taseh Melacha B'Yom HaShvi Shabbat Shabbaton Mikra Kodesh Kol Melechet Avodah Lo Tasu. Sounds a lot like this phrase later on with regards to Chag HaMatzot, right? Shivat Yamim B'Yom HaShvi Mikra Kodesh Kol Melechet Avodah Lo Tasu Shabbat Hu LaHashem B'Chol Moshvoteichem. So you have to keep Shabbat, and with this system of 6 days of working, 7-day rest, now we move on to a section about the holidays. Now, what Devarim does, what Deuteronomy does, when for the 3rd time we read about Chag HaPesach and Chag HaMatzot, is that Devarim uses Sabbath language to speak about Shabbat. And so now we have an insertion of covenantal relationship into the Pesach experience. So if you look at the very end of this passage in Devarim, Perek Zayin, Sheshet Yamim Tochal Matzot U'B'Yom HaShvi Atzeret LaHashem Elokecha Lo Taseh Melacha. So it sounds like we're talking about Shabbat, but actually we are talking about the Chag preparation for the Chag HaMatzot. So now, why am I going through the trouble of talking about these 3 passages regarding Chag HaPesach and Chag HaMatzot? Because we have an important backdrop that we have to understand that really biblically, Pesach is not one holiday, it's 2, with the primary one being the Korban Pesach on the 14th day of Nisan, and the association between Chag HaPesach and affirming the covenantal relationship between Israel and God is very, very important. You might think that of the 3 pilgrimage holidays, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, that Shavuot would be the most important one, because Shavuot commemorates the time that Israel comes to Sinai and gets the Torah, and this is the revelatory experience, the first communal revelatory experience, and this is the pinnacle of affirming this nascent relationship that God has forged with Israel. But actually, Pesach is more at the foreground of the biblical holidays than Shavuot, because Pesach is the why. Pesach explains why is there a covenantal relationship, a commitment that whether Israel likes it or not, they are in this relationship that requires their loyalty. Shavuot might be the culmination of the Pesach story, but the Pesach story is where we see the why. And so here's where we have the most intense expression of the covenantal relationship of all the biblical holidays. It's Pesach. And we see this very covenantal aspect to Pesach in the books of Nevi'im, particularly at the end of the 6th century BCE, when things are really, really going downhill for the Judean kingdom in Malachim Bet. So I'll take you down there in the source sheet. What's happening, actually, this is the end of the 7th century BC, the end of the First Temple period. Things are really going from bad to worse. And remember that by 722 BCE, there is no Israelite northern kingdom. The Israelite northern kingdom is exiled by the Assyrians. And from 722 until 586, we have the southern Judean kingdom, this monarchy that has some excellent kings, has some scoundrel kings. But by the end of the 7th century BCE, the prophet Jeremiah is saying, you need to repent or things are going to get very bad. In the 7th century BC, Babylonia is becoming a bigger and bigger force. Assyria is waning. And by the end of the century, Babylonia has conquered Assyria and is the major threat to the survival of the southern Judean kingdom. Now, when this is all happening, the Judeans are being told by their prophets, you're not observing your laws properly, and many of them are assimilating into their neighboring city-states. And among all this, we actually have the rise of a very good king. His name is Yoshiyahu. He decides to clean out the temple and to restore it to its former glory. When this happens, they find a scroll. We don't know what is in the scroll. We know it's a scriptural scroll. Chazal, well, many rabbinic sources say this is the scroll of Deuteronomy. Not necessarily. It could have been another scroll, but we do know that in the scroll that they read, that's found in the temple as they're cleaning it up, they find a reference to the holiday of Pesach, and this galvanizes a great reform. This is called Yoshiyahu's reform. They read the scroll and they realize, oh my goodness, we have not properly been keeping the laws. And the following spring, Yoshiyahu initiates this great restoration of the Pesach holiday, and he commands the people, if you look at verse 21, keep the Passover to the Lord your God as prescribed in this book of the covenant. Al Sefer Habrit Hazeh, very interesting language. No such Passover had been kept since the days of the judges who judged Israel. And so the sign of returning to God is encapsulated in the restoration of the holiday of Pesach. We don't know here, are they talking about the Korban, or are they talking about Chag HaPesach, Chag HaMatzot? We don't know, but we do know that affirming the covenantal relationship is encapsulated in this holiday. But the question is, what was the holiday? How are they keeping it? Was there a Seder? Was there Haggadah? No, we have no evidence of that at all. We do actually have some very interesting literary evidence regarding how Pesach was observed as we move into the middle and the end of the Second Temple period. We have some fascinating evidence. And we also have a lot of evidence that there was no Seder and no text of the Haggadah. But look at this fascinating papyrus that was found at the very beginning of the 20th century, written in Aramaic. Some of you might know about this papyrus. It's called the Passover Letter. What's amazing about this, it was found in a little island in the Nile, in an island called Elephantine. And what's incredible about this Aramaic papyrus, first of all, papyrus is great because in a dry climate like Egypt, they can lie preserved and untouched and unchanged for thousands of years. So when this papyrus was found among dozens of others in this island in the early 20th century. These were Aramaic papyruses. This was an incredible discovery because it attested to the existence of a Jewish community that lived on this island in the beginning and middle of the Second Temple period. And this community of Jews is thought to have originally been part of a Persian military garrison. So this is a little complicated, right? I spoke about the Assyrians, then I spoke the Babylonians. In the 6th century BCE, the Babylonians are conquered by the Persians. And when Darius says to the Jews at the end of the 6th century BCE, you can go back to Judea, of course, we know many Judeans don't. Some of them stay in the eastern regions of the empire. Some of them go to northern Egypt. And some of them become part of the military army of Persia. And what scholars think happened is that a Jewish Persian garrison settled in the island of Elephantine, and they wanted to observe their ancestral law. And ultimately, over time, they settled there with their families, so that Elephantine became actually a place of residency for Jewish families for a few centuries. And we have some of their personal letters, private contracts, business dealings. It's an incredible cachet of material. But what's so cool about some of this papyri is that it's dated. And the Passover letter that was discovered at Elephantine is dated to 419 BCE. Of course, they don't write 419 BCE, but they date it according to the year of the king. And so we know that this was written in 419. And what is the letter? The letter was written from Jews elsewhere in the Persian Empire, providing on behalf of the Persian king official authorization to the Jewish community at Elephantine to observe Pesach. It's really actually an incredible document. I don't have the whole thing up here. Some of it is restored. You can see that some of it is scratched out, or if you see the brackets over here, it means that either there's a lacuna, something is scratched out, or there's a rip or a hole. So some of this is restored. But what do we see here in this letter? To my brethren, Yedoniah and his colleagues, the Jewish garrison, your brother Hananiah. So Hananiah is writing to his friend Yedoniah, who lives at Elephantine, and the community that Yedoniah represents. And he says, the welfare of my brothers may God seek at all times. Now in this year, the 5th of King Darius, this would not be the same Darius that we know at the end of the 6th century, word was sent from the king to Arsames, who's a lower level Persian official, saying, authorize a festival of unleavened bread for the Jewish garrison. So this is what you got to do, Hananiah says to Yedoniah. Count 14 days of the month, Nisan, and observe the Passover. Chag, well, let's see. Is this Chag Pesach, Hamatzot, from the 15th to the 21st day of Nisan, observe the festival of unleavened bread. So it seems to be two distinct things. Observe the Pesach and observe the festival of unleavened bread. Be ritually clean, take heed. See how it's in parentheses? That means it's not a space in the text. What it means is that we're helping you understand what he means by clean. Do not work on the 15th or the 21st day. They have a little chol hamoed, even in the early Second Temple period. Don't drink beer, right? Anything with yeast in it. Don't drink anything, don't eat anything where there's leaven from the 14th until the 21st. For 7 days, it shall not be seen among you. Don't bring it into your dwelling, seal it up. So this is an incredible document because it's one of the earliest attestations that they're Pesach cleaning, right? Getting everything out of their house. They're still keeping the holidays distinct. And what's so interesting is that it seems that this Hananiah is acting on behalf of the Persian government. And so our question is, did all holidays require such official authorization? Maybe they needed authorization because these are employees of the Persian government, but it also seems that there's some anxiety about the celebration of Passover, and that without this green light, Passover might not have been celebrated, or perhaps celebrated with anxiety, because we will see it is associated with the otherness of Israel, and that Pesach becomes a little bit of a trigger both for Jews and for especially for Greeks and Romans, because it brings to the fore all the things that Greeks and Romans and maybe Persians are saying about the Jews, that the Jews push themselves to the side, that they are insular, that they think that they're special, uniquely chosen, that God has favored them over all the other nations. And this bothers, of course, the Greeks and Romans, who think that the Jews are just clinging to their barbaric, their ancestral law, and that they're not good citizens of the world. The Jews are saying, no, it's not that at all. It's just that we're better than you and special. And the Greeks and the Romans don't like that. And so for them, Pesach is a reminder of how the Jews separate themselves from the broader world. And we'll see that this galvanizes, this gives way to a lot of tension, particularly in the first century. So moving on to one of the most interesting late Second Temple documents that we have. This is the Book of Jubilees, written sometime in the 2nd century BCE. So Jubilees, you might know of this text, is an incredibly popular work in the Second Temple period. It's even possible that some Jews thought that this was a scriptural document. It's written in Hebrew. It's a rewriting, although it's not a great phrase, but that's the word I'll use. It's a rewriting of all of Sefer Bereshit and the beginning of Sefer Shemot in 50 chapters. And so what we have in Jubilees 49 is the very end of Sefer, of the Book of Jubilees. And the Book of Jubilees is unique in a number of ways. The main way in which it's unique is that it has its own distinct calendar. And this calendar, even though the author is a very pious Jew who emphasizes the holidays and dietary law and circumcision and Shabbat and all those things, and in many ways is proto-midrashic, on the other hand, Jubilees has another calendar, and that calendar is solar. So if you're a Jew living in the 2nd century BCE and you think, I need, by the word of God, I have to observe a solar calendar, what are you saying about every other Jew? Well, I'm pausing, but everyone's on mute, so I'll answer my own question. What you're saying is that any Jew who is not observing a solar calendar is eating on Yom Kippur. Right? And any Jew who's not observing a solar calendar is not bringing sacrifices on the holidays, not observing the holidays correctly. Everything is off kilter. If you in the ancient world are a Jew, a pious Jew who observes a solar calendar, then pretty much every other Jew, or 99% of the Jews out there, are doing it wrong, but in the worst way. And Jubilees passionately adheres to this calendar. It's the core, it's the skeleton of the entire book. It's, maybe you would even say, the argument, the central argument of the entire book is that we have to be calendrically observant, if you will. And not only that, but in Jubilees, the most important of all the holidays is Pesach. And so, whereas he says, Abraham kept Sukkot and Yitzchak kept Shavuot, and this is very proto-midrashic, of course, because later in Genesis Rabbah in the 5th century CE collection of Midrash, we'll see again that this theme that the rabbis are observing the holidays, but actually this idea we see in the 2nd century BCE Hebrew Book of Jubilees that the patriarchs, sorry, did I say rabbis? The patriarchs are observing the holidays. And of these holidays, Chag HaPesach is the most important. So he ends with 23 verses regarding the Paschal sacrifice and the observance of Chag HaPesach. For Jubilees, Chag HaPesach is much, much more important than Chag HaMatzot. He keeps them as 2 distinct holidays. And again, he makes reference to Shavuot and to Sukkot, but it's Pesach with which he ends the Sefer. And for him, this is the moment of covenantal affirmation. He just goes on. And over you'll see some things I underlined, but the most important phrases I put in bold, because he's repeatedly making reference to one day, right? Remember this is a bad translation. Remember this day, all the days of your life. Observe it, right? It's just one day, the 14th of Nisan, from year to year. He does say that there's Chag HaMatzot, but really the key here, the main affirmation across the whole annual calendar of this relationship that we have with God that is indestructible and everlasting, this is Chag HaPesach. Chag HaPesach is incredibly important for this author. And I want to point out to you this paragraph over here. You see it? Getting some nods? So what's interesting about this paragraph is that it gives us our very first hint as to how this holiday was celebrated. We know that there was no Seder, right? And so whenever someone says, oh yeah, Jesus' Last Supper, that was a Seder. Well, no, not really. I mean, that's like a cute connection that a lot of people like to make, but what would a Seder have looked like in 32 CE? It would not have been anything comparable to what we do today, but it was Chag HaPesach for Jesus. So they were eating the Paschal Lamb, fine, but it's not a Seder, right? They weren't like singing Magi, Rafsa, not in 32 CE. But so look at this paragraph. The plague was very grievous in Egypt. There was no house in Egypt where there was not one dead. There was weeping, lamentations, and all of Israel was eating the flesh of the Paschal lamb, drinking the wine, lauding, and blessing. And so this is incredible, because this gives us a hint that not only were they just eating the Korban Pesach, but maybe there was a ritual to gather together and drink wine. Was it the 4 kosot? I don't know. But it seems like this is part of the ritual, not just a casual like, oh, does anybody have some Manischewitz? It seems like this is really something that was part of the ritual. And it's even possible that they were saying Hallel. And if this is correct, that we have a 2nd century BCE text that's saying they ate the Paschal lamb, they drank the wine, they said Hallel, right? Those are the 3 things that we see in Jubilees. Then this is the core upon which the rabbis build the whole Seder system a couple centuries later, right? But it starts with Chag HaPesach. The most important thing is the sacrifice. Of course, that's, easy in the Second Temple period when you have a temple, and we're going to see in Josephus that millions of people are going to Jerusalem to sacrifice the Paschal Lamb, millions. We have the numbers in Josephus, but that maybe even in the Second Temple period, there is an element of something else. So not taking away the importance of the sacrifice, but supplementing it with wine drinking and with Hallel. We don't have a Seder, we don't have Haggadah, but maybe we're starting to flesh out the practice a little more with a more ritualized meal. And again, Jubilees is so interesting because we have this single day, Chag HaMatzot, where is it? Reference to this day. I lost my place, but over and over, we're talking about this one day. Remember this day, all the days of your life, observe it from year to year, over and over. That's what we have in Jubilees. What's so interesting about Jubilees is that it is probably, of all the sources we're going to read or we're going to look at in this hour or so, Jubilees is the most particularistic. It is incredibly anti-Gentile. It is anti-outsider. It is even anti-Jewish in the sense that for the author of Jubilees, Israel is not all of Israel. Israel is only those Jews who correctly observe the laws. And so anyone who's not doing it the way that the author is doing it is not going to be saved in the end time, is not in God's favor at all. And the notion of election is incredibly important for the author. And when it comes to the theme of election, Pesach is at the foreground, the main calendrical sign of the election. Still, with all this description, we see no Seder, we see no Haggadah, we just see wine and Hallel, possibly. We also have, by the way, I hesitate to describe the late Second Temple period as being increasingly fractured and divisive. But we do have differing opinions in the late Second Temple period, because by this time, Jews are living all over the Greco-Roman world. By the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, Jews are, actually the majority of Jews are not living in the land of Israel. We have maybe up to 1 million Jews in Egypt. We have Jews in Antioch to the north of the land of Israel. We have Jews in Rome. We have Jews to the east still. And we do have hundreds of thousands of Jews in the land of Israel, but probably by the late 1st century BCE or early 1st century CE, by the time we get to this great philosopher, Philo of Alexandria, who lives in Egypt, probably the majority of Jews are not speaking Hebrew or Aramaic. They're probably speaking Greek. And Philo of Alexandria, who lives in, like I said, lives in Alexandria in Egypt, sometimes gets a bad rap as a Hellenized Jew, but actually careful or even not so careful reading of Philo's writings will reveal that he is a very pious Jew. He keeps the laws. He does allegorize, as we all know. So everything for him that is done across the year of Jewish festival observance has allegorical meaning, particularly Pesach. So he makes reference to the practice of not eating leavened bread a number of times, and he allegorizes it. And the question is why? Why is it so important for Philo to find the hidden meaning here? He has something, his interpretation of why we eat matzah will be very familiar to you, because we all learn this interpretation about matzah and we attribute it to the rabbis. One of the most fun things that I do in my work is that I find Second Temple sources that push rabbinic thought back closer to biblical times. And a lot of what we see in Philo actually looks pre-rabbinic or proto-rabbinic. So just as Jubilees in the 2nd century BCE is saying, oh, the Avot, the patriarchs kept the mitzvot and the holidays, and we see that again resurfacing in Midrash. The same thing with Philo. You'll be familiar with this interpretation of matzah. So he's talking about how when you hear certain things, as if you are a righteous person, you have to filter out anything that doesn't raise you spiritually. And then he brings a proof text. The proof text is from Exodus 12:39, and he says, look at this verse. The Israelites baked their dough, which they brought out of Egypt, into buried unleavened, I don't know if that's the right word, buried unleavened cakes. They needed the savage, untamed passion. That's a Greek word, passion, with aid. It can also mean suffering, as we know from the Passion of the Christ. They needed the savage, untamed passion with aid of reason that softened it as though it were food. And the method by which they softened it and wrought it to something better was revealed to them by divine inspiration. And they did not utter it out loud. This is very difficult stuff, but treasured it in silence. Their hearts were not lifted up by the revelation. Rather, they were bowed in submission, and all proud thoughts were humbled. And so eating this unleavened bread symbolizes the humbling of the souls of the Israelites before their God. This idea, of course, we talk about it every year, that matzah is humble and that it reminds us to be humble. We see it in Philo. Now, this isn't actually the main reason why I'm citing this particular passage. Well, I want to get to the special laws where we see some more interesting reference to actually how Pesach was practiced. But look at the second paragraph over here. Let us say nay to all hesitation and present ourselves ever upgirded and ready to give thanks and honor to the Almighty, for we are bidden to keep the Passover, which is the passage from the life of the passions to the practice of virtue. And so just like the Israelites were always ready, right, with their loins girded, ready to serve God, fast and ready to go, just as they made haste in making the matzah. So we have to gird our loins and transition ourselves from the life of the passion to the practice of virtue. Clearly, Philo is explaining this practice of eating matzah metaphorically. And I think it's possible that the emphasis on separation of Israelites and the election of Israelites, the chosenness, the superiority, the insularity of the Israelites, all this makes Philo rather uncomfortable. Philo is living in a cosmopolitan center, the crown jewel of the Roman Empire in Alexandria. Philo sees himself as a pious Jew, but it's very important to him that he present Judaism as being in line with Roman values and also contributing to the Roman world. So we see very little in Philo about the covenant and the covenantal election and that theme within Pesach. What do we see? We see something very universal. We have to humble ourselves before God. We have to focus on virtue, right? These are words that he's writing, of course, in very high level Greek. These are words that any Greek would have appreciated. Depart from a life of the passions, right? This is Stoic language. This is exactly how the Stoics wrote in the 3rd and 2nd century BC. Depart from the life of the passions and practice a life of virtue. This is vocabulary that Greeks and Romans would have understood. So in a way, he's universalizing the holiday. But then look at a different treatise. This is a treatise in which Philo defends the particular laws of the Jews, not focusing on the ethical laws like do not murder or do not covet, but the laws that seem to be specific to the Jews, like dietary laws and circumcision. And in this treatise, Philo argues that the allegorical meaning behind these laws actually advance Greek and Roman values. Sorry, do you see this mech? Do you see something just popped up on my screen? Okay, I got rid of it. Okay, so in the special laws, he discusses the holidays, and look at what he says about Chag HaPesach. After the feast of the new moon comes the fourth festival, that of Passover, which the Hebrews call Pascha, Paschal Lamb, Pesach, it's the same word, on which the whole people offer sacrifice beginning at noon, continuing till the evening. When that was done, was then done, the law enjoined to be repeated once every year as a memorial of the gratitude due to the deliverance of the Israelites. And now look at this. When I highlight, do you see that I'm highlighting? Yeah, okay. And those who are to share in the feast come together, not as they do to other entertainments to gratify their bellies with wine and meat, but to fulfill their hereditary custom with prayer and songs of praise. Now, Philo was so different from Jubilees. Philo is writing in Alexandria in Greek, very influenced by Aristotelian and Stoic thought. Jubilees is a very insular Jew living, perhaps a sectarian Jew, living in the land of Israel, speaking Hebrew. But look at what they both say about what it means to keep Chag HaPesach. What do you do? Well, the fact that he says we don't only drink wine just to fill our bellies means that they actually are ritually drinking wine, right? We don't only do that just for entertainment, just like the Greeks and the Romans are sitting around on their, decorative pillows drinking wine to have symposium and parties, but we're doing it because it has a transcendent meaning. But what I care about is the fact that they're doing it, right? They're drinking the wine and they're fulfilling their hereditary customs with prayer and songs of praise. Again, does this mean that they are praying the Psalms? And that becomes part of the Seder, right? Hallel? I think it does. The fact that we have a parallel here between the writings of Jubilees and the writings of Philo with these specific elements, wine and songs of praise, I think that this is the crux, the skeletal bones of what will become the Seder when the temple falls and they can no longer bring the Korban Pesach. What do? Well, they have in place a system upon which to build. Right? And this is more generally representative of how the rabbis operate. They're not inventing a new religion, but certain things such as the synagogue. The synagogue is not invented after the temple falls. The synagogue is concurrent with the second temple. And so when the temple falls, the rabbis have in place a system to accommodate a reality of Jews mostly living in the diaspora and not having access to a temple. So that's just a tangential comment that I want to make. Okay, so a few things here. Philo is unique because he does move away from the particularist interpretations of Pesach by allegorizing its meaning. But once again, Chag HaPesach is distinct from Chag HaMatzot, and Chag HaPesach seems to be the key here. Like Jubilees, again, there's Hallel, there's wine, but there's no matzah, there's no maror, there's no Haggadah, right? In terms of the celebration meal and eating the Paschal lamb. Now I want to move on to our good friend Josephus, the late 1st century CE Jewish historian who writes 4 collections. He writes an autobiography known as Vita, a life. He writes the first systematic defense of the Jewish religion ever produced, called Against Appian, who was a very anti-Jewish interlocutor, Appian, in the 1st century. And he writes Antiquities of the Jews, which is a 20-volume work of history going up to his own times. And we have the Jewish War, which is an account of course, the Jewish War. But he actually opens it way before the war breaks down in 66 CE. He opens it with the Herodians at the end of the 1st century BC, because Josephus believes that once Judea becomes a client king to Rome at the end of the 1st century BCE, that's when everything goes downhill. It takes a century. So the Jewish War is a 7-volume work that he actually begins way before the actual war. And I want to point out two passages, one from Antiquities of the Jews and one from the Jewish War. Well, Antiquities of the Jews is a little bit less important, except that when he identifies Pesach, he's specifically talking about the sacrifice. That's why I cited it. Here he's talking about the historical moment of the Jews sacrificing the lamb for the very first time, and he describes it as a holiday that is all about the sacrifice of this Paschal lamb. There's nothing else. He really doesn't even talk about Chag HaMatzot. But look at, and also it's just one day in Antiquities. But what's the meaning, the broader meaning of Pesach for Josephus and for the later rabbis? We'll see that despite Philo's best efforts to allegorize a holiday, for most Jews, it's laden with covenantal meaning, with covenantal promise. And what happens is that by the end of the first century, to have a holiday that has all this covenantal promise, it has to be associated also with messianic implications, because the first century is just such a disaster for the Jews. And so when you're thinking about the covenant and you're watching your temple falling, even before 70 C, when you're thinking about this covenantal promise, right, every year when you celebrate Pesach, and then you're seeing that you're under Roman occupation, that there's incredible poverty and suffering, the only way to make sense of this covenantal promise is to say that it is a promise yet to come, right? And so we were once redeemed in our ancient past, and we will soon enjoy a redemption in the near future. So to think covenantally in the first century is also to think messianically. And in the first century, we have an extreme rise of messianic thought, especially in Judea among the Jews. And so we'll see that Pesach becomes a very, very tense time. And that on many Pesachs over the course of really the whole first century, bad things happen. Bad things happen on Pesach because Jews are tense. The Romans don't like Pesach because it reminds them that the Jews are othering themselves, and the Jews are filled with anger at the Roman occupation on Pesach. Okay, so if you look at this, this passage in the Jewish War over here, this story takes place in 4 BCE, when Herod the Great has just died and his son Archelaus has taken over, and the Jews are very angry because Archelaus seems to be just like his father. He's going to continue oppressing the Pharisees, these proto-rabbinic Jews, and of course we know Herod killed thousands of them. And the Jews are protesting. They're protesting against Archelaus, they're protesting against the Herodian family, and they blame Herod for the fact that Judea is now a client kingdom of Rome. Judea is not fully incorporated into the Roman Empire until 6 CE. Just to note, I know it's already 12:15, so maybe I'm going to go on for another 5 minutes. Is that okay, Nisa? And then we'll have questions and answers. I don't hear you, but I'm gonna decide that it's okay. So we're getting to the closing here. Okay, so in 4 BCE. Pesach comes. This is the first Pesach of Archelaus's reign. Herod has just died, and a vast crowd, Josephus tells us, a vast crowd streamed in from the country for the ceremony. And this is a difficult phrase. I'm going to explain it. The promoters of the mourning for the doctor stood in a body in the temple, procuring recruits for their faction. What the heck does that mean? Okay, you have to know a little bit of Greek, because this is a weird phrase. They're not doctors, they're doctors of the law. These are probably Pharisees, sophisti, like sophists. That's the Greek. So what this is probably referencing is those who are mourning the doctors of the law, those who are mourning those Pharisees who were killed by Herod, go to the temple on Pesach to protest Archelaus. And so there are riots at the temple in 4 BCE, that the temple becomes filled with riots when you think that this would be a time for celebration and holiday and kind of the spiritual focus on God. No, it's just filled with political protests against the Herodian family. And of course, this alarmed Archelaus, who, wishing to prevent the contagion from spreading to the whole crowd, sends in a tribune. Now that's not good. This supposedly Jewish or Judean king is sending in Roman officials or likely Roman officials to stop what's going on, right, by force. And what ends up happening is that 3,000 Jews are killed. The soldiers falling unexpectedly upon the various parties is 4 BC, right? We're way before the actual fall of the temple, but this is an important source because things are so bad for so long. these various parties are busy with their sacrifices. They kill about 3,000 protesters and they disperse the remainder among the neighboring hills. And so this is on Pesach. Archelaus stops all festivities, says, everybody get out. He orders everyone to leave the temple, and they all abandoned the festival and departed. So can you imagine this incredibly intense time where you're thinking about Pesach and you're doing these liturgical rituals that are reminding you that God's covenantal promise is everlasting, and you're doing it under Roman occupation, and you're thinking, this does not correlate with my reality, right? I am celebrating God's saving of the Jews, and yet I am suffering in an unspeakable way under Roman rule, because the Herodians were not trusted. Even though Herod's father supposedly converted to Judaism, the Jews did not view Herod and his family as Jewish. They thought that he converted as a political maneuver. They did not trust Herod, nor should they have trusted Herod, because Herod murders most of the Hasmonean family. He even murders his own Hasmonean wife, right? The very famous princess Miriam, who the rabbis say he preserved her body in honey. I don't know if anybody knows that story, but why are the rebels choosing Passover as a day of rebellion? That should be a spiritual day. Why are they choosing this day to rebel against the Herodian family? I mean, this is kind of perplexing. If you go to a much later source in the Jewish War, so remember I said the Jewish War has 7 books. In the end of the 6th book, now we're in 70 CE. So we're 74 years after this incident where 3,000 Jews are murdered by Archelaus. In 70 CE, again, we have this shocking scene that takes place on Pesach of rebellion against Rome. Well, we're already well into the war over here, but I want to point out a few very interesting things. Okay, accordingly, on the occasion of the feast called Passover, at which they sacrifice from the 9th to 11th hour, and a fraternity gathers around each sacrifice of not fewer than 10 persons. Look at what he says. The victims, that doesn't mean Jewish victims, it means the Paschal lambs. The Paschal lambs were counted by Rome. The Romans were very good at conducting censuses, and they counted to see how many people were in the city. And this is at the height of the war, the height of the Jewish rebellion against Rome. The Paschal lambs are counted, and how many Paschal lambs are in the city? 255,600 Paschal lambs. Now, Josephus says, let's assume that there are 10 people gathering to eat one Paschal lamb on average. What does that mean about how many people are in the city of Jerusalem at the height of the war? Well, he says 2.7, but as far as I can tell, and I'm not very good at math, 250,000 sacrifices would be 2.5, or somewhere between 2.5 and 2.6 million. I'm not sure why Josephus rounds it up to 2.7. But we're talking about millions of people, between 2.55 and 2.7 million Jews in Jerusalem at the height of the war. It's packed, absolutely packed on Pesach. And of course, this becomes a very, very tragic event, because these Jews get stuck in Jerusalem. They get stuck in the siege, and many of these Jews are killed by the Romans. It's incredible that they're coming to observe this holiday even when they know this is a very, very dangerous time. The war starts in 66, so they're well into the war. And look at what it says. Over here, Josephus tells us, all those concealed underground had been either slain or made prisoners by the Romans. Now the victors are not the Paschal lambs. Now they're Romans. I wonder if he did that on purpose. He used the same word. Instituted a search for those in the mines, tore up the ground, slew all whom they met. So the Romans are looking for Jews who are in hiding. They found 2,000 dead, of whom some, victors instituted a search for those in the mines, not victims. So horrible was the stench from the bodies which met the intruders that many instantly withdrew, but others penetrated further through avarice, trampling over heaps of corpses. So in the middle of this Pesach celebration, thousands and thousands of Jews are killed by the Romans. So this is just a disastrous and very, very painful scene. We even have accounts from Josephus of cannibalism. The starvation in Jerusalem becomes so terrible as we approach Tisha B'Av, the fall of the temple, that starving within the siege, Jewish mothers are eating their babies. So this is very reminiscent of what we see in Eicha when we're thinking about the fall of the first temple. Anyway, so let's move on very briefly to the last two sources, because we get a very different feel of Pesach when we look at the text that the rabbis write after the fall of the Second Temple. So fast forward to the rabbinic period. We have a Pesach that historically we have a holiday that is two separate holidays, Chag HaPesach, Chag HaMatzot, and it's Chag HaPesach that is so laden with this covenantal meaning. It's an incredibly intense holiday, and also an incredibly tense holiday when it's observed under Roman occupation. The holiday itself is a trigger for Jews who are observing a holiday as an affirmation of a covenantal promise that they don't feel they're living in. They haven't experienced it. They're anticipating it. It's almost like, what's the point of Pesach? Yeah, we were taken out of Egypt, but look where we are now. How can we find meaning in a holiday where that redemption didn't last? Look at where we are in 40, 50, 60 CE. Whatever benefits we enjoyed from Pesach are gone. We're suffering. Our temple has fallen or is in danger. So how in the first century and following the Second Temple's fall, how would you as a Second Temple Jew or as a rabbinic Jew, how would you appreciate the meaning of Pesach when you've suffered so much? So the Haggadah does a few interesting things, I think, to accommodate this new reality. First of all, the two holidays are combined. I'm just going to take a drink. The two holidays are combined. And there are a few theories as to why we don't see the distinction in the rabbinic period between Chag HaPesach and Chag HaMatzot. And one is that by combining these two holidays, we de-emphasize Chag HaMatzot. Sorry, we de-emphasize Chag HaPesach. When we de-emphasize the Paschal Lamb holiday, we achieve a few things. First of all, like I said, Pesach probably brought very bitter memories to the minds of many Jews who are observing this holiday and are wondering, where's our divine intervention now? It's also possible that with the rise of Christianity, Pesach becomes very, very important to the early followers of Jesus. They're not called Christians until the 3rd or 4th century, but the early followers of Jesus put the Pesach experience at the foreground of their observance, and they say, look, the Messiah has come. And Jesus has replaced the Paschal Lamb. And the rabbis are saying, no, the Messiah has not come yet. Jesus is not the Messiah. And to emphasize that our redemption is yet to come, we are going to end the Pesach experience by saying, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim. The redemption is to come. And what did this achieve? It achieved a message of comfort. Rather than saying the redemption came, and we should all commemorate it, memorialize it, and appreciate it, what the Haggadah does is it says, God saved us once, and now we look to the future because we have the hope and the belief that God will save us again. And so we end with this Hallel, the Hallel that, if I'm correct, was read in the time of Jubilees, right, 2nd century BCE, in the time of Philo, 1st century CE, but it gets new meaning in the rabbinic period, in this period of exile and suffering. The Hallel itself is the affirmation that God is going to save us once again. And so we read at the beginning of the Seder and at the end of the Seder, these affirmations of future redemption. This is the bread of destitutions that our ancestor ate in the land of Egypt. So once we celebrated this holiday, and look at how we're not distinguishing anymore between the two holidays, right? We're opening up with halachma. And yeah, anyone who is famished should come and eat. Anyone in need should come partake. Now we are here. Next year we'll be in the land of Israel. This year we are slaves, and you can imagine for the rabbis, they did feel slaves to Rome. Next year we will be free people, but they believed that just as God brought this divinely wrought intervention and allowed the Jews to escape when they were at their lowest points as slaves in Egypt, so too we are occupied by Rome, but this is going to be a temporary occupation. And we similarly end the Seder with this affirmation of a future redemption. And so this is what the rabbis contribute to the Pesach experience, even though it's not inherent necessarily to what we think of as the authentic observance of Pesach, right? Again, the biblical period and the Second Temple period, we don't have this text, this Haggadah, but this text that is messianic and laden with this tint of future redemption is what offers new meaning to the rabbinic experience of Pesach. And so now we're going to close the lecture portion of this learning session. And I'm going to give you 30 seconds to think about questions or comments that you have. I'm going to turn off the sharing of this source sheet. By the way, if you want me to email you the source sheet, I'm very happy to. Just, well, I guess you don't have my email, but I'll give it to you. Take a minute to think about your questions and comments, and then you can click on raise hand, and Nisa will unmute you. And while you do that, actually, here, let me, this is very fancy. I have, I don't know if you can see, I know it's not fancy. I didn't even plan that. It was just right next to me. M. Simkovich, it looks very blurry to me. M. Simkovich at ctu.edu. Simkovich is without a T. MSIMKOVICH at ctu.edu. If you want me to send you the source sheet, or maybe email Nisa, and then if I'm putting Nisa on the spot, but I can always send Nisa the source sheet if that's easier. I'm happy to get it to you somehow. So any questions or comments? It looks like there's some chats.
Livia has a question. Livia, you want to ask a question?
Yes, I just wanted to know if the Bdikat Chametz and the fact that we should not have Chametz already on the eve of Passover, of the Chag HaMatzot, could it be a little bit of a remnant of Chag Pesach? The fact that already, you know, in reality, the reality is that already on the eve of Pesach, there's not much chametz in Jewish homes. Isn't that already, and in the afternoon, people try not to go to work and cannot eat chametz already. Is this Dika chametz your Pesach a little bit an entry, already entering the festival already, and a remnant of Pesach holiday? Does it make sense?
Yes, 100%. I think you're correct. Maybe not biblically, right? Because when we look at Shemot, we have the distinction between Korban Pesach, that's one thing. And then after Chag HaMatzot is introduced, then we have this Kol Ochel Chametz Nicharta Nefesh Ahim Yisrael. But I think you're right that it's possible, maybe even likely, that by the end of the Second Temple period, the notion of getting rid of chametz precedes the preparation of the Korban Pesach. So I think that is very possible. I don't know that I have literary proof to back up what you're saying, but it sounds right to me. So that by the rabbinic period, it's not a tough thing to fuse the holidays completely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions?
Okay, doesn't look like there are any other questions. I'm not sure if people can hear me. I hope they can. Okay, Malka.
Yeah, I hear you, Nisa.
Okay, great. Okay, so thank you so much to Malka, like to Dr. Simkovich. Like she said, if you have any questions, you can email. I included the email in the chat box, so you can check that out. Simkovich at ctu.edu. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to take 1 minute breather, and then if you want to come back for Rabbi Daniel Reifman's talk, we'll begin that in about 2 minutes.
Thank you all very much, and thank you, Nisa.
Chag Kasher v'Sameach.
Chag Sameach, everybody. Have a good Chag. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, so for those who stayed on, as Dr. Simkovich mentioned, if you want to be one of the faces that we can see, it's a little nicer for our teachers when they can see more faces. So just raise your hand and I'll turn your video on. Thank you to Micah for joining us last time. Okay, Rabbi Reifman, if you want to begin.
Okay. Hold on a second. I realized that this is a very text-based class, and one of the nice things about Zoom is that I have the chance to share my screen. So I'm going to share the screen so that you can see when we do some more of the textual analysis. The topic that I want to talk about is really about the book of Exodus as a whole. And therefore it relates to the experience of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the actual Exodus, but it goes beyond that, and it kind of puts the Exodus in the context of the book of Exodus, and then relates to themes that go well beyond the book of Exodus. And I hope that we'll take them so far that they will, in a sense, back. It's like full circle back to the Pesach Seder and give us a chance to appreciate some of the deeper themes that I think are latent in the Haggadah text. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen here, where I have the text of the book of Exodus laid out in Hebrew and English translation. And we're going to study, we're going to look for a number of different themes, all of which revolve around the root yada, to know. The story of the Exodus really begins in chapter 8 of the book of Exodus, where the Torah says, "Vayakom el chadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yada et Yosef." Now there was a new king over Egypt. I'm going to move this over here. Now there was a new king of Egypt who knew not Joseph. This word yada, in the context of this verse, seems very simple and very straightforward. But what I'm going to suggest as we go through the book is that when the word yada, the word know, appears in the book of Exodus, it appears almost invariably with a whole range of, it appears kind of fraught with meaning, is one way to put it. Which is to say, the word yada signals a deeper theme or set of themes in the book of Exodus that I think clue us into something that we don't always appreciate about the book, the kind of subtext of the book as it unfolds. Mean that Pharaoh didn't know who Joseph was. There is, of course, a famous debate in the Talmud when it says it was a new king. Was he really a new king, or was he a king who simply changed his ways? Meaning, should the verse be taken literally, or is this a metaphor for the fact that the king was now had related to the Jewish people? But likewise, you can ask, did he really not know who it was, or he conveniently make himself as if he didn't know? Did he consciously forget who Joseph was? Joseph, of course, is a pivotal figure in the last quarter of the book of Genesis, and within the who saved Egypt from famine, and who played a critical political role in raising the Egyptian monarchy above what it had been, and giving Pharaoh powers that he had not had up until that point. So it's particularly striking that the new Pharaoh doesn't know who Joseph is, so to speak. But if we look at the context of the first few verses in the book of Exodus, we notice that not knowing is especially problematic here. Because if you look at how the book of Exodus opens, the book of Exodus in Hebrew is Shemot. These are the names of the children of Israel. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. And then we have a list of the sons of Jacob, including, of course, Joseph. The irony of the fact that the book of Exodus is called the book of names, Shemot, is that from verse 8 on, we have almost no names for several chapters. All of the characters who are introduced, almost all the characters who are introduced anonymously, sometimes clumsily so. For example, Vayakam Melech Chadash al Mitzrayim. Who is this Melech? What's his name? Pharaoh. Right? He's called Pharaoh, and yet it doesn't immediately identify him as Pharaoh. Pharaoh, of course, is only a title as well, but it's striking that it leaves out the word Pharaoh here. As we go forward in the book, turn to the beginning. As we turn to the beginning of chapter 2, you don't have to turn. I'm scrolling down the page for you. It begins, Vayelech ish mi beit Levi vayikach et bat Levi, and there went a man from the house of Levi, and he took for a wife the daughter of Levi. Later on in the book, we learn who these people are. Who is this man from the house of Levi? His name is Amram. He's actually Levi's grandson. And who is this wife he's taking? This is the daughter of Levi, the son of Jacob, and her name is Yocheved. But it doesn't name them. They're anonymous. And the woman conceived and bore a son, and so on and so forth. None of the characters here are named, even though later in the book we will learn exactly who these characters are. The baby is, of course, eventually named Moshe. He's not given a name here. His mother takes him and hides him. And then in verse 4, and his sister stood afar to know what would be done to him. here also we have the word no. We'll come back to that maybe in a few minutes. But who's this sister? Who's this mysterious girl who's watching him? This is, of course, Miriam. There seems to be a deliberate attempt to avoid naming any of the characters. In other words, from the moment that we have in chapter 1, verse 8 saying, or the Torah saying about him, he did not know who Joseph was, all of the characters in the book are shrouded in anonymity. Nobody knows who anybody else is. The anonymity that characterizes the first couple chapters is kind of shadowed by a second very important theme here, which is deception. None of the characters in the first couple chapters are straight with one another. Nobody is honest or forthright with anybody else. And you see this already from the way that Pharaoh talks to the Egyptians about the Israelites. Starting in verse 9, he says, "V'yomer lamo hine am b'nei Yisrael rav ve'atzum mimenu." And he said to his people, "Behold, the people, children of Israel, are too many for us. Come, let us deal wisely with them. Hava nitchak malo," he says. Dealing wisely here, the implication of wise means deal deceptively, deal with trickery. In other words, the enslavement that Pharaoh places upon the Israelites is not enslavement for enslavement's sake, but enslaving them because he's afraid of what will come. There is not a direct relationship between what he wants and the means that he gets to it. He uses deception in order to in order to minimize the threat that he sees in the multiplication of the Jewish people. And then, of course, we have the famous story with the midwives, where again we see the king using deception in order to stem the tide of Jewish fecundity. He says to the Hebrew midwives, when you do the office of the midwife, the translation here is a little antiquated. When you do the office of midwife to Hebrew women, you shall look upon the birth stool to be a son, you shall kill him, if to be a daughter, you shall live. In other words, he tells the midwives to deceive the women who they are birthing, and to kill the baby as if the baby had died in utero or during the process of birth. The midwives, of course, don't follow what he says. They use a deception of their own. When he questions them why they don't listen, they say, because the Hebrew women are not like as the Egyptian women. This is verse 19. For they are lively, and they delivered when the midwife already come. They delivered ere the midwife come unto them. In other words, they've already delivered. We don't even have to help them. By the time we get there, the birth has already happened. So they too are deceiving Pharaoh by saying this. But of course, these are the two midwives are the only two characters in this section who actually get names. And the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, you read at the beginning of this episode, one of whom the name was Shifra, the other's name was Pua. Why do these characters specifically get names? And here I think we start to see a key to what a name means, at least in this section of the book of Exodus, which is they get names because they are truthful with some aspect of what they're doing. They may be deceiving Pharaoh, but in terms of moral truth, they are acting in accordance with their own inner truth. And therefore they are named. The Midrash, of course, the irony is, of course, the Midrash takes these names and says, no, that wasn't their real name. Really, this is Yocheved and Miriam, Moshe's mother and sister in disguise. But be that as it may, the tendency of the Midrash to take one mysterious character with another, something that I call the law of conservation of biblical personalities. These themes of anonymity and deception play out in interesting ways as we go forward. One of them, of course, one of the major episodes here is, of course, the salvation of Moshe. Moshe's mother, Moses' mother, places him in a basket in the river when she realizes she can no longer keep him safe. This too is a kind of act of deception. She knows full well that whoever finds the baby will adopt him, pretending that it's their own, or that's in fact what she's hoping will happen. We don't need to use a terrible amount of imagination to see in this a kind of Holocaust scenario where parents are Parents are forced to give up their children and put them in terrible, terrible danger, hoping against hope that they will be saved. In other words, the kind of anonymity and deception that we see here create a very ominous, heavy environment and give you a sense of the terrible, terrible straits that the Israelites find themselves in, where everything is hidden, everything is deceived, nobody can be open, nobody can be true. It's therefore remarkable what happens to Moshe. Not just anybody finds him, but the daughter of Pharaoh finds him. She too, of course, does not have a name. She immediately sees the truth of who he is, and therefore, here too, she gives him a name. The name of Moshe is interesting. The name Moshe, it says in verse 10, Vatikra Shemo Moshe, Vatomer Kimin Hamayim Mishitihu. She called him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. That's a very unusual verb that appears in very few other places in the Bible. Umberto Cassuto gives an alternate etymology of the word Moshe. He says, if you look at the Egyptian of Moshe or Mose, it means son. And therefore, on one level, he's given the name Moshe, which of course becomes his name for the rest of the Bible. On the other hand, Moshe too could be seen simply as she called him Moshe, meaning she called him son. She adopted him. In any case, Moshe too is a figure kind of shrouded in mystery. But the remarkable thing about Moshe is there is an element of truth to the way that he is found, identified as an Israelite, and that he can be raised in the open by his mother, who, whenever somebody questions her, can say, I'm just raising the daughter of Pharaoh's son. And therefore, Moshe becomes the crucible of this shift between anonymity and namedness, and between deception and truth. Moshe, as he grows older, goes out, sees his brothers. He's under no illusion that he's actually Egyptian. He knows his real he knows his real parentage, even though he's been raised in Pharaoh's palace. He sees an Egyptian smiting his brother. This is verse 11. In those days, Moses was growing up. He went out to his brother and looked at his birth. He saw an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. We have an act of seeing. And then he looked this way and that, and when he saw there was no man, he smote the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He sees, he kills, and then, of course, he deceives. He hides the Egyptian who he kills. And then, in verse 13, the next day he went out, and behold, 2 men of the Hebrews were striving together. They were fighting with each other. He said to the one that did wrong, the person who hit the other one, wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? Sorry, I apologize for the antiquated translation. And he said, who made you a ruler and judge over us? Thinkest thou to kill me as you did the Egyptian? And Moses feared, and he said, surely the thing is known. In Hebrew, achen noda hadavar. Here again, we have the root yada. The thing is known. Moses realizes that his action, this decisive action that he takes in saving the Hebrew from the Egyptian who is ready to kill him, that thing has become known. Something is open, something is revealed, and the truth comes forward, and Moshe now must flee. As the chapter unfolds, of course, Moshe becomes a savior of another kind. He flees to Midian and saves the daughters of Yitro from the people who are chasing them away from the well. But the real turning point in the story here, it comes at the end of chapter 2. In the Hebrew, the king of Egypt again dies. The children cry out to the Lord, they sigh from their burdens and they cry out. Up until this point in the story, God has been almost completely absent. The only place we've seen God is when he blesses the midwives because of their righteous actions. God enters the story here again for the first time, again, not coincidentally, I think, because Moses has now shown himself to be someone who is a savior, and now we can proceed to the next stage of the story. What's the next stage? Vayishma Elohim et na'akatam, vayizkor Elohim et brito et Avraham et Yitzchak et Yaakov. God heard their groaning, God remembered his covenant. And now in verse 25, Vayar Elohim et bnei Yisrael, vayeda Elohim. There is once again an act of seeing. God sees the Israelites, Vayeda Elohim, and God literally knew. The translation here, that God took cognizance of them, is a way of smoothing over a difficulty in the Hebrew, because in the Hebrew it simply says, Vayeda Elohim, God knew. God knew what? It seems to me the act of knowing here is somehow significant in and of itself. What did God know? We don't know, but God knows something. And the very fact that there is a moment of knowing, an act of knowing, a cognizance of something, some sort, point in the story. Because now we turn from Asher lo yada et Yosef to a process of knowing. The way that the root yada appears in the rest of the book of Exodus, let me just do a little exercise with you. One of the nice things about having the entire book of Exodus on the screen is we can do a little search. So we'll hit Control F for the root yada. Move this so you can see what I'm doing. And as we search, you'll see the root yada, signified by the letters Dalet Ayin, in the book. And we'll move forward. I'll leave it highlighted so you can see where it appears. Almost every single time it appears in a very freighted sense. Somebody knows something, not simply in the sense that they cognitively process it, but there's a deeper resonance to the notion of somebody knowing something. For example, right here at the beginning, when God appears to Moses at the burning bush, God turns to Moses and says, Ra'o ra'iti et ani b'mitzrayim. I have surely seen the affliction of my people that are in Egypt. I have cried by reason of their taskmasters. Ve'etzakatam shamatim b'nei moksav. Ki yadati et mach'ovav. God knows their pains. The notion here of knowing is interesting because it indicates, of course, that God understands something about the way that somebody else feels. That's a very difficult thing to do, unless, of course, you're God, because how do you ever know what somebody else is feeling? Other people's consciousness is always concealed to us. But God can know. God can know what we think. The more difficult thing, as the story unfolds, is not God knowing us, though that too becomes somewhat more problematic as the book unfolds, but our knowing God. Okay? Let's leave the episode of the burning bush for just a moment and skip ahead to the beginning of chapter 5. Okay, Moses is appointed at the bush to redeem the people, and he goes back to Egypt, and he appears before Pharaoh, and he says in chapter 5, verse 1, Thus said the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may feast unto me in the wilderness. And in verse 2, Vayomar Paro, mi Adonai asher ashma b'kolo l'shalach et Yisrael. Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should hearken my voice and to hearken unto his voice and let Israel go? Pharaoh says, who is this God? And now, lo yadati et Adonai v'gam et Yisrael lo ashaveach. Pharaoh says, I don't know this God. In case you missed the reference, the deeper resonance of the word yada, we will now track the word yada as it appears throughout the next couple of chapters, which tell the story of the 10 plagues. Watch what happens. Chapter 6, verse 7. Sorry, let's skip ahead a little bit. Chapter 7. God foretells to Moses before the 10 plagues begin, but Pharaoh will not hearken unto you, and I will lay my hands upon Egypt. And in verse 5, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch my hand forth upon Egypt. The 10 plagues, the entire purpose of the 10 plagues becomes so that Pharaoh and the Egyptians will know who God is. Watch what happens. The plague of blood. Ko amar Adonai, bezot teda ki ani Adonai. Thus said the Lord, in this thou shalt know that I am the Lord. The plague of frogs. the yada, actually, the Dalet Ein appears in frogs, so that's a little bit of a red herring or a red frog. Skip ahead. V'fleiti bayamahu et Eretz Goshen, asher ami aleha v'bilti sorry, missed one in the Plague of Frogs. Pharaoh says, get rid of these frogs. And Moses says, fine, when should I get rid of them? Chapter 8, verse 6, he says, Vayomer lemachar, vayomer ki dvarcha leman teda ki in kadonai Eloheinu. And Moses said, again, tomorrow. And he said, Pharaoh says tomorrow, right? Get rid of the plague frogs tomorrow. Be it according to thy word, thou mayest know that there is none like unto the Lord our God. Again, skipping ahead to the fourth plague. The plague of Arov, of wild beasts, won't touch the land of Goshen where the Jews live. To the end that mayest know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth, and so on and so forth. In almost every plague, we find Moses saying to Pharaoh, so that you should know, for example, in the plague of Deber, the fifth plague, thou mayest know that there is none like me in all the earth. In the plague of Barad, of hail, that you shall know that the earth is to God's, and so on and so forth, all the way until we get to the splitting of the sea, when God says again, this is in chapter 14. This is the final, not the final plague, because we've already had 10 plagues, but the ultimate plague, the ultimate destruction of the Egyptian army in the Red Sea. And the Egyptians will know that I am God. Everything that God does in Egypt is to convey the sense of knowing God. So what we have here is a confirmation of this theme that everything revolves around the process of knowing God. Knowing God, therefore, becomes a central theme in this part of Exodus, and I'm going to suggest further on in Exodus as well. And now I want to backtrack to the episode of the burning bush to see how the process of how complicated the process of knowing God is, why it becomes a problem, and then gradually how this concept of knowing God unfolds through the book. We said before, the process of knowing is tied in with the concept of giving a name. In order to know somebody, in order to give somebody a name, you have to understand something about them. You have to know them. And here is a really critical and curious point. When Moses comes forward and God says to him, you're going to go to Egypt to tell Pharaoh to release the Jews. In verse 11, again, we have a sense of a loss of identity where Moshe says, who am I? Who am I in the sense that I'm nobody, right? I'm not a powerful person. I'm not somebody who can make Pharaoh do something. But also, who am I in the sense that Moses doesn't really know who he is in an existential sense. Vayomer, God says, because I will be with you. And now, Moses doesn't say, who am I? He turns to God and says, well, who are you? In verse 13, Vayomer Moshe Elohim, Hinei anochi ba'al b'nei Yisrael, va'amarti Elohem Elohei avotechem shlachani aleichem. Moses says to God, behold, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me unto you, they shall say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? What's Moses supposed to call God when he speaks to the Israelites? And now God says, I am that I am. Great, that was really helpful. Just as a minute ago, he said to Moses, I will be with you, ki imach, in verse 12. So to here he says, asher. In other words, God defines himself by a tautology which says nothing. I am that I am. Meaning what? What it says to me is, that God is so beyond the reference point of anything else that we are capable of knowing, the reference point of anything that we can grasp or ponder or consider, that God can only be defined relative to himself, which is of course useless for us, but it shows how far beyond anything else God is. And here we get to an essential point about naming. When you name something, how do you name it? The beginning of the process of naming is a process of contrast. I teach somebody what something is by saying, first of all, what it is not. For example, right, if I were standing in front of a classroom, I'd have a marker. I would say, this is a marker, right? If you didn't speak English and you didn't understand what a marker was, and then tomorrow I said you bring me a marker, you might bring me something else that vaguely resembled a marker. You might bring me a stick, right? Because it's the same shape, roughly the same size. And I would say, no, that's not a marker. This is a marker, right? In other words, I begin to define marker by that which it is not. And this is an essential point about the process by which children learn language. We learn language by the process of contrast. But actually, contrast is in some ways fundamental. The more contrast we have, the more narrowly we can define things, and the more useful and functional language becomes. God is so beyond our frame of reference that God cannot be defined in comparison or contrast with anything else. He can only be defined in reference to himself, hence, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. And now we begin to grasp the problem of knowing God, because God is so far beyond our frame of reference, so beyond our ability to comprehend, that we just kind of get lost in the ether, in the tautology of God is God is God, that nothing really makes sense at all. How do we come to solve the problem of knowing God? That is in some ways the story of the rest of the book of Exodus. So before we get back to the 10 plagues, let's see what God says here. Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. You can almost hear God laughing up his sleeve and saying, okay, let's see what he thinks of this. And then Yomer Ko Tamar Libnei Israel, Ehyeh Shachani Aleichem. Okay, Ehyeh sent me to you. Not much cool. Vayomer Elohim El Moshe. God says more to Moshe. Ko Tamar Israel. This is what you should say to the children of Israel. Adonai Elohei Avotechem, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov Shlachani Aleichem. Zeh Shemi Le'olam. What is my name, says God? My name is the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. In other words, the first way that we get to know God, maybe the most fundamental way that we get to know God, is when we develop a relationship with God. We can't know God by contrasting God or comparing God to anything else. That's impossible. We can know God through a positive relationship, not a contrast. A negative is we define something by what it is not. But we define God by the fact that he relates to human beings. And he develops a relationship through the book of Genesis with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, your forefathers. And therefore, says God, that is what you shall call me. This is stage one, the most fundamental, and I think we'll see the most essential way that God is characterized. The plagues, of course, take us beyond that, and immediately afterward proceeds to tell the story of the Exodus in actually a great amount of detail. Starting in verse 16, go gather the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord God of your fathers, God of Isaac, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to you, saying, I've surely remembered you, seen that what is done to you in Egypt. And then from verse 18 through verse 22, God gives us a reasonably detailed summary of the plot. He gives essentially a preview of everything that's going to unfold over the next 10 chapters. So the next way that we understand God is not just through a relationship between God and human beings, but through God's actions in this world. And again, that's what God keeps emphasizing. He's God and Moses, who's speaking for him. The way that God acts in the world, for example, going back to some of the references in the 10 plagues. Leman Teda, God says in the plague of Ov, Ki ani Adonai b'kerev haaretz, that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. God is not only the God of the heavens, God also is the master of and controller of all of creation, and God manipulates creation to his own ends. God acts in history. God acts on the affairs of mankind. And so on and so forth, the same thing. God's presence is also felt on the earth through his actions. Okay, that is the story, I think, through the end of the book of the Exodus story proper, through the end of the 10 plagues and the splitting of the sea. We now move into what is, in some ways, the most subtle and problematic episode in terms of knowing God in the entire book, and that is starting with chapter 16. The Jews have passed the sea. They've sung the song of the sea. There's this great revelation. They see God. They see God's actions in the world. And then when they get to the wilderness, they start complaining. They complain for water. In verse 3, oh, if we had died in Egypt, when we had food, when we had water, etc., etc. God says, God gives them water, and when the water is too bitter, and he tells Moses to throw the stick into the water, and the water is fit to drink. And now in chapter 16, we get to the episode where he begins to provide the Israelites with food. And in verse 6, Vayomer Moshe ve'Aaron l'kol bnei Yisrael, erev vidatem ki hotzia Adonai etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim. Come night, you shall know that God took you out of Egypt. And here again, we hear a deeper resonance of the Jews coming to know and understand God through the process of the miracles in the desert. I want to stop and think about the desert for a moment, and think about the desert as a context in which the Israelites can come to know God in yet another dimension than we found in Egypt. When we think about desert, Midbar, of course, doesn't mean desert, it means wilderness, but there's a sense in the wilderness. Wilderness is a place that is empty, and this is a theme that comes up throughout references to the wilderness, in references to the wilderness throughout the Bible. Wilderness is a place that's empty. There's nothing there. There's nothing of use there. And when we think about the experience of being in the wilderness, wandering without a clear destination, you get a sense of what it means to be overwhelmed by infinity. You get a sense of what it means to look around you and see the same view in every direction. Every direction looks exactly the same. Every sand dune is exactly the same. Every grain of sand is exactly the same. If we think about meaning as constructed by contrast, the midbar, the wilderness or the desert, is a place where there is no contrast. You know somewhere in the back of your mind that somewhere there is water, somewhere there is civilization, somewhere there is something other than what you see around you. But what you see around you is all exactly the same. This is a theme that's tapped by Aviva Zornberg in her book on Exodus, and she also ties it into two other elements that we have here in the wilderness. One of them is this food. One of the foods that God provides the Israelites with is the quail that falls at night. It's not clear if it falls every night or only falls once, or then again in the book of Bamidbar, falls again. But what does fall every day is the manna. Okay, so here we go again. In chapter 16, verse 11, Shamati tznurat b'nei Yisrael. I have heard the murmurings of the children of Israel. Daber lehem lemor bein harbaim tochlu basar boker tisku lachem. At night you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall eat your fill of bread. Vidatem ki ani Adonai Elohechem, and you shall know that I am the Lord. So first the quail falls, and they eat the quail, and then in the morning they find the substance called man. or actually, they don't know what it's called yet. They see, V'hinei al pnei hamidbar dak mechuspas dak kekfor al haaretz. Behold, upon the face of the wilderness, a fine scale-like thing, fine as the hoarfrost on the ground. Vayiru b'nei Yisrael v'yamru ish lachiv manhu ki lo yadu mahu. And when the children of Israel saw it, they said to another, what is it? For they knew not what it was. They call it man, because man means, what's it? They don't know what it is. They can't identify what it is. It is so far outside their frame of reference, they can't even give it a name. It doesn't compare or contrast with anything they've ever known. And the name, or not name, sticks. This is a substance that doesn't have a name. And when you understand the experience of the man, you understand what was so mysterious about this thing. As we read forward, we learn, for example, that it doesn't matter how much each of the Israelites collected, they ended up with the same amount. Imagine going to the supermarket and furiously filling your cart with as much stuff as you can. This is actually an experience that some of us have this coming week when we shop for Pesach. And somebody else going to the supermarket and picking up a couple things, and you get online at the checkout, and you both have exactly the same things in your cart. It's such an unnerving experience. It's such a super surreal experience that you can't even describe it. You can't make sense of it. The manna falls each and every day except for Shabbat. You're not in control of when it falls, how it falls. It's something that's outside of your control, outside your frame of reference. It's deeply unnerving, deeply surreal. And I want to suggest it gives the Israelites a sense of what it means to rely on God and in some sense be God. What is God's existence like? God's existence is so mysterious and unknowable that you can't even put a name to it, and that is the man. When we see the man related to later on in the book of Deuteronomy, it becomes a symbol of the Israelites not knowing what God was doing, but of course that becomes a remembrance of the miraculous nature of their existence in the wilderness. Right now, it's a mystery. Right now, it's deeply unnerving and unsettling. The memory of it, however, becomes very, very potent. And it's fascinating to see when they actually want to set themselves up for remembering what the manna was, remembering what the man was. Moses said to Aaron, this is chapter 16, verse 33, Moses said to Aaron, take a jar and put an omer full of man therein and lay it before the Lord, and to be kept there throughout your generations. Why do they take a sample of the man? If something doesn't have a name, the only way you can remember it is by actually taking the thing itself. You can't represent it with anything else, and therefore you must take the thing itself. And the last piece of this puzzle in the wilderness, the last kind of tool that we use that God uses to give the Israelites a sense of who God is, what it means to live, what it means for God to be an infinite, unknowable being, is the Shabbat. The manna is tied up intimately with Shabbat. Shabbat is a day when the manna doesn't fall, when the man doesn't fall, but that it's more than that. The sixth day, we read in verse 22, on the sixth day, somehow everybody filled their shopping cart and they ended up with twice as much man as they usually did. The leaders of the people come to Moshe and they say, hey, what's going on? This is what the Lord has spoken. Tomorrow is day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake what you shall bake, cook what you shall cook, sieve what you shall sieve, then all that remaineth lay up for the morning. What are they told about Shabbat? Prepare, and then wait. Let's see what's going to be. They leave it, and it doesn't spoil. Every other day when they left it over, it spoiled, and today it didn't spoil. What does God tell them about Shabbat? Ru'u, God says, Moses says to them, Ki Adonai natan lachem haShabbat. God has given you the Sabbath. Al ken noten lachem bayom shishi lechem yomayim. So He's giving you 2 portions on the 6th day. Shivu ish tachtav ayitei ish mimkomo bayom hashvi'i. Abide ye every man in his place. Let no man go on his place on the 7th day. What's the essence of Shabbat in the Midbar? Shabbat is a day where you sit and do nothing. It's a day of empty time, just as the Midbar is an empty place. It's a place where you feel what it means to exist outside of time, where the hours stretch endlessly. And now I think the Israelites get a sense of what it means to be God and rest on the seventh day. Resting here is an absence of any positive sign, any positive meaning. It's simply a way of existing outside of everything. If we were meditating, we would all go, and that is what Shabbat in the wilderness is. The man, the Shabbat, and the wilderness, the three things together, give the Israelites a very subtle, but I think very deep sense of what it means to exist out of time, out of place, and out of meaning. The experience is very unnerving, I think, and we see later on in the Bible, especially in the book of Bamidbar, which we're not going to have time to get to, quite how unnerving it is. They get really fed up with the man. They call it this cursed bread. They can't stand it. But what we see here is actually very interesting and in some ways very disturbing. They complain again for water. God gives them water. And then they call the place that he gives them water. Vayikra Hashem makom masa umeriva al riv b'nei Yisrael v'al nasotam et Adonai lemor hayesh Adonai b'kirbeinu im ayin. They named the place Masa and Meriva because of the striving of the children of Israel, because they fought with God, because they tried the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? With all these miracles, they still can't put two and two together and say, oh, it's God who's providing for us. In other words, there is a sense here of trying to convey a sense of infinity and being outside of time and space. That's not something that human beings can really get their heads around completely. And therefore, the Israelites are left here with a sense of, where is God? Is God really among us? And now, as we go forward in the book of Exodus and get to the Ten Commandments, the revelation of Sinai, the Ten Commandments, I think we can read the Ten Commandments with a new understanding. God spoke these words, saying, I'm Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. How do we understand that introduction? Is it the first of the Ten Commandments? Is it a commandment to believe in God? I want to suggest that it's kind of like a second introduction, as if God, revealing himself at Sinai, is saying, you may not remember me, but I'm the God who took you out of Egypt. We've met before. In other words, the Israelites, we imagine the Israelites as living in this kind of divine existence, being completely aware of God, not realizing quite how difficult that is. And it's only at this point in the book that we start to develop another mechanism of giving the Israelites not just a sense of a personal relationship with God, that God has somehow had a relationship with their forefathers, not only a sense of how God intervenes in these dramatic miracles as in Egypt, but a way of understanding that God is with them on a daily basis, day in, day out, that God's presence is among them. And that is a tremendously difficult thing to do. Throughout chapters 16 and 17, in the beginning, in the very first baby steps of their journey through the wilderness, there's a sense that God is trying to convey, here's who I am, here's what it means to exist with an infinite being. But we realize there needs to be more than that. And the rest of the book of Exodus, as we move toward the conclusion of the book, is in some ways posing two solutions to that problem. One of them is, of course, the Mishkan, the tabernacle. When God says to build a tabernacle, a place where he will reside, it is, of course, to provide a symbol of the fact that God is among them. And again, in a very suggestive language, we have at the end of the commandment to build the tabernacle, which is described in great detail, verse 45, "V'shachanti b'toch b'nei Yisrael v'hayiti lachem Elohim," and I will dwell among the Israelites and I will be for them a God. And then, "V'yad'u ki ani Adonai Eloheim asher hotzeiti otem me'eretz Mitzrayim l'shachni b'tocham." They will know that I am the God who took them out of Egypt to dwell among them. The Mishkan becomes a physical symbol, not merely of God's presence, but a means to know God. And then, of course, intertwined with the tabernacle itself is another reference to Shabbat. Shabbat acquires a number of different meanings, a number of different rationales throughout the book of Exodus, and then in the book of Devarim as well. It is in the Ten Commandments, of course, a remembrance, a memorial to the fact that God created the world and rested on the seventh day. Later on, it becomes a day that you give your animal and your workers a day to rest. But now, if we see here in the book of towards the end of the command to build the tabernacle, V'atadaber el b'nei Yisrael, this is chapter 31, verse 13. V'atadaber el b'nei Yisrael emor achat shabtotai tishmaru ki oti beni u'benechem ledorotechem v'adat ki ani Adonai mekadishchem. Shabbat now is not merely an empty day, a day without meaning, a day without any sense of time or purpose or significance. Now Shabbat becomes a sign. Shabbat conveys meaning, and what meanings does it convey? Beini uvenechem, between you and me, says God, it is an oath. It signifies something. It has positive meaning, and that meaning is Vadat ki ani Adonai b'kadishchem. God not only sanctifies the Shabbat, through the Shabbat, God also sanctifies the people of Israel. So Shabbat and the Mishkan become a kind of long-term solution to the problem of knowing God. How do you know that God is among you? You have a physical sign of God being in a certain place, as inaccurate as that is, as that may seem to confine God's presence to a certain place. And God is also in a certain time. Or rather, we have a place and time that we designate for God and come to know God through that process. There is no point from now on, throughout the rest of the Torah, where the Israelites will say, oh, is God among us or not? There are problems that the Israelites have. The Israelites will rebel many times throughout the book of, a little bit in the book of Vayikra in Leviticus, and then throughout the book of Numbers, throughout the book of Bamidbar. But it's not because of a lack of God. It's not because of understanding that God is not there. In fact, sometimes it's the opposite, of being too close to the divine presence, so that anytime they misbehave, the punishment has to be immediate and severe. If you follow this theme through the rest of the Torah, you will see that if we do this exercise of the search for the root yada in the book of Dvarim, in the book of Deuteronomy, it comes back full force. Why in Dvarim? Because in Dvarim they're about to head into the land of Israel, where they won't have God's presence among them immediately in their face. And therefore, Moses is constantly saying, know that God is among you, remember that God is among you. The entire book of Dvarim, the entire book of Deuteronomy is in some sense revisiting this theme and trying to make sense of what it means to know that God is among you when you're living in an expansive land and the temple is very far away. I want to just one last comment to backtrack to something in the Exodus and talk again about this notion of knowing God through a personal relationship. This coming Shabbat is Shabbat HaGadol, and traditionally one of the meaningful, this is according to Sefer Olam Ra, a book that talks about the calendar throughout Jewish history. The Seder significance of Shabbat HaGadol is that it was the day in Egypt, the day that it says that the exodus from Egypt fell out on a Wednesday, which means the day that they're commanded to take the sacrifice 4 days earlier, Shabbat. That is the day when they did the first action that God required of them in the process of redemption, and therefore becomes a marker of how ready are the people to be redeemed. Are they willing to actually take the first step on their own and do something to indicate they deserve to be redeemed or want to have an active hand in being redeemed? And this is, of course, the section where we have the very first legal section in the book, chapter 12, where Moses commands them about the process of taking the sacrifice, bringing the sacrifice, and making their doorposts, etc., etc. At this point in time, one time they celebrate the Passover sacrifice in Egypt. They celebrate it once in the desert, and they don't celebrate it again until they get to the land. But already in chapter 13, the Torah looks forward to when they get to the lands, and then we have, in one of the points where it talks about telling your children, which of course we say at the Seder and talk about the significance of the 4 conversations with children about the Pesach sacrifice. Here in chapter 13, verse 8, the process of bringing the sacrifice is a moment at which we connect all of the dots. We connect the fact that God has done great miracles, dramatic miracles in showing that he controls the world, the fact that God is with us as people, and of course, in a personal relationship. The fact that we take the animal and bring it as a sacrifice to remember the Pesach, to remember the Exodus from Egypt, instructing a personal relationship with it, not only about the God of a relationship with God, not only about a relationship with our forefathers, but about a personal relationship here. It doesn't talk in the Bible as it often talks. And therefore, the Pesach sacrifice becomes a critical way that each and every individual Jew comes to establish that relationship, that personal relationship with God, that, as we said, is the first stage of coming to know in the kind of existential sense. So I wish you a Chag Kasher v'Sameach, a very happy and kosher Passover. I'm going to take questions if people have them.
Okay, you have to raise your hand if you're going to ask a question, and then we'll unmute you. So we'll give a minute for people to. Okay, Livia.
Yes, I have a question, Rabbi. Know if the concept of da'at connected to the consumption of the manna could be related to etz ada'at and eating the fruit in the Garden of Eden?
Yes, I think so. Again, when you look at the way that dot plays out in many different books, in the book is, of course, another very rich trove of references and resonances of the word dot. You can think about the Midbar as a kind of mirror image of Gan Eden, right? In Gan Eden, Adam and Chava have everything they could possibly want. They want for nothing, and there's only one thing they can't have. In the Midbar, they have nothing, and there's only one food that they can have. So in some ways, as I said, it's a mirror image. But yes, I think that in both senses, it's a way of knowing God.
Just sometimes it's a little bit difficult for me to understand what can be learned from the fact that knowledge seems to be connected with human ingestive behavior.
That is interesting.
For me to walk through that connection.
Yeah, I'm gonna punt here and say that you're right. It has to do with ingesting. That makes it kind of physical in a way that we don't expect knowing to be physical. We expect knowing to be psychological and cognitive and kind of higher. I'm not quite sure what to do with that.
My only way to square that is ta'am is really the taste, and really it's incredible, you know, the tongue and the palate and the fact that we do have.
There is a kind of a way
to which was not necessary. God was kind enough to give us, you know, the variety of various flavors. It was not necessarily for survival. Maybe it was to some extent. And ta'am being in Hebrew also reasons and justifications.
Yes.
That I could see so far. There could be other reasons.
I completely agree. I think those are all excellent points, and I think this is an area that you can take and kind of develop on your own. Nisa just reminded me that I want to encourage everyone who's on the call, if you yourself are interested in the Drisha Summer Kollel, just a taste of the kind of learning that we do over the summer. It's a wonderful 6-week program of intensive learning, but also learning of a different kind that you might do in other contexts. We do a lot of thematic learning. This year we'll be studying the 9th chapter of Bava Metzia, which is the laws of paying your workers on time, and laws of collateral, which are 2 laws that are found in Torah, but also have obvious and very rich contemporary resonances. The afternoons are spent in a range of classes that cover Tanakh and Jewish philosophy, but also Talmud classes for those who want something equally intensive in the afternoon. It's a really wonderful community that doesn't exist in many other places, where Jews of many different backgrounds, many different learning levels come together and create a community centered around Torah learning, prayer, and also chesed, also acts of kindness. We devote our hours in the evening several times during the summer to working with the homeless population in southern Manhattan. So again, please look at our website for information about the Drisha Summer Kollel, and I hope we'll see some of you there.
Yeah, I'll make a note that I think most people on the call are not necessarily qualified for the Kollel itself, which is open to undergraduate and recent graduates, including graduate students and rabbinical students, but that we do offer our Talmud classes, and we're going to have a robust evening courses that you can join. So just keep an eye out on our website, and feel free to email me if you are interested in learning with us this summer. And if there are people in your life who would qualify for the Kollel, please let them know about it. And thank you so much to Rabbi Daniel Reifman over there in Israel. Thanks. Chag Kasher v'Sameach to everyone. Thank you for joining us. And yeah, be in touch, and we hope to learn with you again soon and do many more webinars.
Chag Kasher v'Sameach.